Hello everyone, welcome to this year's 2022 Azure Back to School. This is my third year doing this, absolutely fantastic. I always say every year it's reminiscent of you going back to school and seeing all your friends in September. I know that for some of you the summer was awesome and you didn't want to go back to school. I always look forward to it because if you do love learning and you do love what you do, it's always exciting. So today we're doing a little bit of a fun whirlwind session. So we'll do zero to hero Azure API management validation policies. So we'll do it content intensive, not so much slide intensive. So the big takeaway is what are the techniques that this can apply with? How can this be beneficial, whether you are fronting an API or whether you may be fronting something like a blob or a service bus topic or queue where it can become very useful. We'll delve into a little bit of API design and talk about some schemas. And the main gist of this is to get a realization of what this can do for you, how it can save you some execution cycles on some of your compute. So if you're not running on, uh, serverless compute that it's free for a million calls or whatnot, and you want to save some executions going to the back end, and you've got an API manager. This could come in and do some cost considerations as well. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and start taking a look at the constructs of today's talk. So first and foremost, the main element that we'll be talking about today is Azure API Management. So in this service, what they are offering is the ability for you to do request validation and response validation, and also block certain responses you don't want going back to the front end. So traditionally, what we have is you'd have your web application, and then you'd have your user. As your user is sending HTTP requests in, you're going to get some responses, right? If you are missing certain key elements, evidently we do one of two things. We do server-side validation, where we take a look at the code that's being sent over or the parameters, the variables, and then we determine if there's anything missing, anything not part of any regex, and definitely doing some cleansing to see if there's anything malicious. Throughout the years, long time ago, there was a lot of server-side validation, and with the advent of a lot of client-side libraries, we do a lot of client-side validation. So you would do client-side, server-side. So in the API realm, the interesting thing that occurs is that you have your user on one side, you've got your API manager, and then simply your API in the back end. So you're easily just sending a request over, goes to your back end, comes back, and then goes back to your user. So the interesting thing here is you forget to place three different key variables that are required. It goes through the API manager, goes all the way to the back end, is processed, and then comes back to your front end. So there are two possible solutions to this. So whoever is implementing your API can look at their front end and do that front end validation and not allow that to go through. Or your backend is going to validate the request and determine if it's erroneous or not, and then send back any details, and then you have to do another roundabout trip with the correct information. So what we want to see today is this piece here. So we're going to concentrate on this slice, which is the API manager. And in that API manager, what we want to do is effectively the same thing that's possible at the front end and in the back end. We're going to be doing some validation. So we'll validate the content, we'll validate the parameters, query strings, path, and whatnot. So that's just essentially the gist of it. The other interesting thing is this. You have yourself an API manager, so we'll represent that as this. And in the back end, you've got an API. Very, very simple. So it makes a lot of sense that your user would want to fire something to your API manager, back to your API, back to your API manager, all the way there, and it's functioning as a proxy. But what if, I'll just take the eraser, this didn't exist? And that sounds a little bit bizarre, but what if you had a workload that was fronted? So there's your user, there's your API manager, and then there's your API, not an API. We'll say that this is a service bus queue. So your user would send something to your API manager. It looks like it's a, you know, HTTP API. So you're working with it in traditional ways, right? You might be going to get yourself a, a token, sending that through. You're getting a response that's an HTTP API, but in the back end, could be AMQP, could be a RESTful service going to a service bus queue. This definitely has a payload, right? So you need to put something in here that has a schema that probably something downstream needs to adhere to and needs to, put the eyes on the prize on this element. So how are you going to enforce this? Are you going to just put this on your 5,000 clients that are using the API, or are you going to enforce it here? So by doing API first design and utilizing request validation, this can go a long way. So today I chose to use Notepad, so it would be a little more fun and feel like we're doing the actual back to school. We're sitting next to each other, we're drawing away on an element instead of using a Visio and then utilizing that. I hope you like this technique. Let me know in the comments for next year and whatnot. So this said, let's take a look at um, an API first design and what exactly is an API schema. So here, what we have is, I'm just inside of Swagger Bear. You could be inside of Stoplight IO. You can actually do this in API management. You could do it in Notepad if you want. This is just one of the different tools. So obviously here we're using OpenAPI. So OpenAPI, here we have the schema, and you'll notice, there's information about the servers, information about, the API itself, and then we have the paths, right? So the paths is describing my API here, right? So it's telling me quite a few different things. And for request validation, the interesting thing is we're describing the different parameters. So this is a query string, has a name, a description. Is it required? It's possible that this is true, and then it has a type. Could be a string, int32, can be also an object. So if you take a look here, right, we can describe different type of objects and what is required in this object, right? There's different elements. What are the different properties? So you see here, a type of string, the format is UUID, and then there's an example given to the user. So all these things come into play to describe the functionality of this API. So how do you take this and apply it inside of Azure API Management so that Azure API Management is aware of all the constraints that you've placed inside of your API first design and decided to do some validation on that to return it back to the end user. So is this possible? Absolutely, it's possible. So you're seeing the API first pragmatics here. What that means is that we have designed the API here inside of a tool. And then as I use the drop down here, it's possible for me, if you take a look here at integration, so just to show you here, we don't have to be always, in this example, we have Azure API Manager, but there's other things, right? There's API auto mapping, API gateway integration, the Lambda, DevOps, Bitbucket, GitLab. Some of these is actually to store your schema and source control, like Azure DevOps services. But the ones that are API managers, you can actually have two-way integration. So you can have, here's my Swagger, and here's my API manager. As I am changing things in my schema that you see here in the background, and actually push the integration, it'll show up in Azure API Management. Then I can determine if I want to do a mock, and then have the requests come back. This can be quite powerful because you can utilize this tooling here to describe your API and work in conjunction with other people. People can come in and put comments. You can give different role-based access control to this. So actually working in unison with someone to define an API, working with the customers that are intended to use this API, and you're working harmoniously. Not only that, is the partner can then test the API out as it's being developed, and same with you. You're taking these constructs and utilizing them to describe. And what we really want to do in today's session is look at the the different parameters and everything, and seeing how things react. So the example we'll use today, and I wanted to use this because it's available to everyone. I don't need to do a GitHub, or I don't need to do anything. If you go to Pet Store Swagger.io, a great example is this Swagger Pet Store where there's this notion of pets, there's a store, there's a user, and we do have a wide array of HTTP. Um, I'm forgetting my word here. Verbs, HTTP verbs that can be utilized. So that's why I like this example. Post, put, get. We have to delete. So a wide range for you to test with. And if you start looking through some of these here, it'll tell you what is required. You can also see an example value and model here. So similarly, evidently there's the JSON here, so we can ingest it in the API manager. You can start putting it inside of the Swagger UI hub if you want to change it and make it your own. It's up to you. So that's the example that we'll be using today is the Swagger Pet Store. And what we've done is we've ingested that inside of our API manager. So here it is here. There's the Swagger Pet Store. Um, and we'll be concentrating on inbound processing of different policies. So if you're kind of new to Azure API management, there is this element here which are your policies, and inside your policies you'll have inbound processing, backend processing, and outbound and on air. And it's important to understand two things. One of them is the policy. So when you're working with something that's inbound, if you have your API, let me just put a different color to showcase. As your API lifecycle starts running, you evidently have something coming in on the inbound that you want to process. So if you want to do your security, your cores, things like that immediately. After the fact, you'll probably have something called a backend where you're going to fire the execution, to the API, Azure Service Bus, Blob Service, logging, whatever your API is instructed to do, it will do. And then lastly, you have what you have on the outbound. So obviously this is going this way. This is what's coming into the element. So here you may want to validate what type of status codes are coming in and out, what type of headers are being leaked. You just definitely don't want to leak some X refer force telling the IP address of some internal constructs. You may want to augment with security elements. These are where you can do all of these items. There's a secondary item which is called scope. Here what you're seeing is, let's just go back here. You're seeing the API, and inside of this API we have an area here, but this is related to all operations. If I take just a method here and I go inside the policy, see that it's empty. So I've defined a policy here that affects all the different methods that I've created here. Then you have another scope level which is just for this element, and then if you can actually go inside of the product, and that's another level there. So you can have global, which is all APIs. So global here, you might want to put a cores policy. You can do something at the product level. You can do something at all API level, something at the API level, and then something at the method level. So that's important to know, and it's just like a whirlwind chat I want to have with you before delving into the different elements. So if you go to inside of Azure, the documentation, there's a section on validation policies in Azure API management, and that's what I want to do a whirlwind tour on today. So this is the gist of it here. And if I were to, just talk to you methodically about this without giving you any concrete examples, you could go read a blog post and it would be as beneficial as watching a 30-minute video. So what is the grandest or the greatest advantage of validating a request? If you are stopping erroneous requests that cannot go to your backend because there's no way it would get processed, you have a second chance to get that front end to actually go in and rightfully send the correct data. That's a very big advantage, especially if you work in things that are load leveled with queues. You don't always want to have to go into the queue element and then do a data fix for that element to go downstream and insert itself in the CRM or DRP. Secondary to this, if you have an API manager that's fronting something like a service bus or a blob service, obviously I can't check the validation in here, right? We're just putting it inside of a construct. So what you're doing is playing the role here of the validator and then ensuring that, things don't pass through that shouldn't pass through. So what kind of elements are we going to be able to see here? So what kind of validation does this like module or this, this set of policies support? So one of them is called the validate content. So what we're going to do here is take the, the schema as a whole, and we're going to say any type of content that comes in, I want to verify the size. So if it's too big, I'm going to reject it. So this is excellent. In the past, you saw a lot of attacks, and it does JSON and XML, not just JSON, but since the industry is on JSON, we'll concentrate on that today. The size is very important because back in the day, I remember XML bombs were a thing. You would send the largest XML possible, and in the hopes of subverting the machine where the process was going to run on. This is excellent. You stop it at the front. There's no sense for somebody to send you a gigantic payload when you're only expecting, a JSON with 12 elements in it. You know that somebody is sending something malicious in intent, or flat out is just scanning you and trying to do reconnaissance, and reconnaissance is never a good thing, right? The secondary thing that this does, it can validate the request or response body against the API schema. So what is the API schema? We saw it here. If you're doing API first, right? So you would create the schema first, and then scaffold, and you'd have your API that you can sort of test against and augment, but you would be doing the schema first. One type of schema is this OpenAPI spec here. We're on version 3. There's different things that go ahead and describe the API. But in this case, we're going to do OpenAPI, which is what this one is based off of here, this Swiper Pet Store. The other thing is you don't necessarily have to do API first design. You can create your API, then use a tool like Swashbuckle, and then generate an API. There's other generators and everything else, and then utilize that and then do your validation against it. So just having the second thing that you can validate are the parameters. So you can go ahead and look at your header, query, or path parameters against an API schema. So this means that you can say, for this header, I want you to adhere to this regex. You need to be an integer. This is required. And also the inverse. You're sending me a whole bunch of headers I have no idea about, and I'm just going to start preventing or detecting. Somebody sending you things that don't make any sense. They're doing that reconnaissance. There might be an API where, this is bad, where somebody puts in a request header and it gives you like admin access or something. They start trying to use that against your API. You don't have this implemented, but you're definitely going to see it in the detect, and then you can put that in your logs and see like what type of malicious traffic is coming in, and then preemptively block it. Not You can also validate the headers. So this says validates the response headers against the API schema. So I know what you're saying. You're saying, hey, wait a second here. Let me just go to here's this area here says it validates the request header, and then here validates the response header. That's right. So the validate parameters on the way in, this module will do header, query, and path. So you can iterate those and then validate it against the schema and do all sorts of work. On the way out, remember we talked about the 3 different blocks, right? There is the inbound, there's a backend call, and then there's an outbound, right? There was an outbound call, so things come in, things go out, things go to the API and come back. This element here, this validate headers, goes in the outbound area, validate parameters goes on the inbound area. So you can validate the headers coming in and the headers going out. So why would you want to validate the headers going out? Definitely you don't want to leak certain things. It's a good way of enforcing, and then also validating that certain things are there, right? So that's excellent. Validating the status code, so you don't want any leaky elements, indirect object references that are doing quirky things to your code. If it's only supposed to send back like a 200 OK or certain 400 elements and just a 500, you don't want this leaking anything else than than that. And so you can validate these GP status codes and then ignore certain things like a 404. A lot of people will say if there's a 404, ignore it. Interestingly enough, if you get a 404, I believe in an API, if I'm not mistaken, it shows up as an error in application insights. So a lot of people frown against that. It looks like it's not found, and then it starts throwing errors in app insights when really it could be bad API design where you're looking for something and you're throwing a 404 and saying, oh, not found, which makes kind of sense. When that occurs in App Insights, it'll light up like a Christmas tree, no pun intended. So that's one way of saying, if it's a 404, we're going to block that, and then you can, handle things appropriately. Switch the status code if you want. It's up to you. So without further ado, what we'll do is we'll go look at our API that we ingested. So once again, just a reminder, we were looking at the Swagger Pet Store that's available online. So very easy for you to add that. We'll go inside of our inbound processing, make sure we pick the right API. So I've just put this against all operations, and we're going to expand. And let me just go to a blue color, and you'll see that what I've done is on the inbound right here, what I've decided to do. So remember that slice I said? So here's that slice here. So if you take a look, I've got that inbound. There it is here. So everything, remember I said everything coming in. There's different scope levels, but everything coming in, this is definitely what we want to do. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is this validate content, right? So what we're seeing here is if you do not specify the content type action I want to detect. And there's a couple of things that you can put here. So I just want to speak on that for a second here, because you'll see these different words of ignore, prevent, detect. If you're going to detect something, you're just going to detect it. You're going to add it to the logs. You're going to add it to this, this error that we have, a error variable, and you're also that's pretty much what that does. The prevent one will actually do a stop, right? So it's going to take a look at the payload, find something out, and it's also going to log, but it's also going to put a hard stop, right? Similar to the web app firewalls. If you've used like Mod Security or Azure Application Gateway with the WAF enabled, you can have it in detection mode or prevention mode. Similarly, it's the same thing. Ignore does just the thing. It just ignores it. It allows you, though, to put the items in so you can know what you're expecting. But you might want to prevent certain items, but some of them you're just putting in there as config. So you want to put ignore. So on this said, just to show you a few examples, if you were not do any type of like validation in Azure API management, things would come in, pass through, go to the API would be, that API's job for it to do anything. So in this example here, what we've done is we've specified a few things. We've said unspecified content type action. I want you to detect it. The max size is this here. So we're going to play with this a little bit, and we'll put it down to 1 and see what happens. Obviously, it can work the other way with too much instead of too little. What happens if the size is exceeded? We want to prevent. I want to do a hard stop. I want to log. I want to send something back here. And the error variable name is request body validation, meaning that when we do detect things or prevent things, I want you to put it inside this variable here, because I might want to take it, and in API Manager, there's a trace. You can trace, and then that'll go to application insights. I can put it into log analytics, or I can just look at it for debugging purposes inside of the trace tool inside of the portal. So, so what we'll do is we'll just go here and start looking at a few of these elements. So the first thing I think we'll do is we'll just go here. I'm using the classic one. It's more blocky and better for presentations, I find, than the other. Oh wow! When it decides to have this, actually, I'll have to reload it because I've been talking for so long. So we'll just go to the portal. We'll go to this deprecated portal. I find it shows better. I like using the other one for clients, but when it comes to presentations, this one here is great. It's very blocky, fits on the screen nicely. Okay, so for this one, if I take the find pet by ID, I am going to wish to try this API. So let's say that I say I want, the first pet, and I send this execution. It's just basically saying the request can be processed, contact the API owner, no problems. If I take, this post create user, I'm gonna try it. Just send the request off. It says it's not allowed, contact the API owner. So we're gonna take a better look at this in a little bit. So you can see that things are working, it's going through, it can have some failures or whatnot. So what I wanted to show is if we go into the Azure API management, we'll go to our pet store. And what we'll do is we'll change, the content size to 1, right? So a little bit too small, but now we can see the control that we have over the size of the payload. So obviously this is more than, just 1 kilobit. So we'll fire this across, and now we can see that Azure API Management has intercepted the call and said, 400 is bad requests. So, and that's what it sends back. The request size exceeds the configured limit of 1 byte. The next thing that we're going to do is, instead of sending this, so we'll just put, something that does not resemble JSON here, and we'll fire that away. 1 second. Oh, actually, this one is trumping. So what we'll do, we'll just go back and we'll put it back to, I think it's 104. See if that, I think that's right. No, it's 102,400. All right, so we'll save this. Go back to our validation, and it takes you saw that I fired it immediately, and it takes about like 5 to 10 seconds for the policy to come into play. So I've been burned with that, doing a lot of OAuth validation. So just word to the why. So you see here, once again, bad request, and it's saying the body of the request doesn't conform to the definition associated with, application JSON. So the snippet of code that is responsible for that is right here. So what we're saying is the content type is application JSON, and we want to validate as, JSON. So evidently I sent in XML, or it could be like uh, something else. And what we want to do is prevent, right? So I've prevented it. I've said it no, it's a no-go. What happens if I, put detect here? Let's take a look at what the variation is. So that's saved. Let's give it a second or two. There we go. Now, what do we get, right? Internally, I've sent in XML. It doesn't know what to do with this XML, can't process it, so I get a different type of error. But things went through, right? So that's the variation. Similarly, if I were to put ignore there, yeah, if I were to put ignore here, it's just going to ignore it, and that's it, that's all. But detect is now placing things inside that variable that I had predefined earlier. It's possible to do content type maps. So you see here, content type map, the missing content type value. So if you're missing something, it's going to put application JSON. So if I don't have application JSON, it's going to put it, and it can also map, this type to this type. So I think that's kind of like a neat feature there. Um, so let's get rid of this here, and let's see what happens if I save this and then I fire something without application JSON. So let's go back to like my get. It's like get pet by ID. I don't think it has yeah, so I'll get the first pet. I'll click on fire, and back here. Let's expand that. Here I have it on detect. So you saw that, it's there's an internal error, contact the API owner. And then if I want this in, prevent mode, let's see what happens. Policy for API saved successfully. Let's wait. There we go. Now we have the, not as friendly error. It says unspecified content type is not allowed. Okay, so for the next example, we're basically going to take a look at some of the schema-based validation. So what we're going to do is look up this get. No, we'll do a add new pet to the store. So we'll go ahead and try this. And let's take a look here. We've got, you can kind of see the request body. There's a string and whatnot. And then I can kind of, send different things. So what happens if here I send in, a 1. Obviously, it's expecting a string. I'm giving it an integer. Let's take a look at what's going to happen. It says, no, you cannot. If I go back to the request validation, um, validate the content, right? Specified content type validate as JSON. The action is detect. So here I would kind of like be grabbing all that information and then being able to evaluate it in sort of like my errors. But I get this friendly, 502 code. Based on that 502 code, I can basically go ahead and see what kind of, maybe changes to the schema I need to do. But now if you put the prevent mode, you'll see that I get the real error, the status code. The body of the request doesn't conform to the definition. And it's telling you here, I'm expecting a string. I got an integer line 5, position 10. This is an invalid type. So what occurred here is it actually took a look at um, my element. So if I, let me just go in here and put string back in there, and it knows that this is, a string versus an integer, and it's doing the validation here at the front end. So what happens if I, there's supposed to be some kind of a string that's added here. This is supposed to be a string, that's supposed to be a string, and I've got multiple elements. Let's see what happens. It's giving you the first one to fix, right? So just showing you a little bit of that functionality there. So this is grand because you can kind of take a look and see what the main issue is here, and it will just prevent it, and it will do like a hard block and send across. If you want to do the detect mode and then throw your own kind of message and then put everything in a conglomerate that shows you like A, B, C, D is erroneous, you can definitely do so. That is up to you and how you want to design things. The next thing that's quite interesting about validating and whatnot is this validate parameters. So you can validate the parameters that are coming in. Obviously, you're validating the schema, right? And then the parameters are the data that's coming in. But one thing that I find really interesting is this unspecified parameter. And if you actually put this as prevent, it does break quite a bit of things. So I just wanted to showcase that first. So if I put this on prevent and just save, and we'll go back to the same API that was like working okay, so I'll click on post, click on try it, and back here. All right, so now just, out of the box, I'm going to send this in, and I'm getting a bad request. Unspecified header content type is not allowed. Why is it giving me this? I haven't said that this is allowed yet in my spec, right? So if I look here, it's telling me parameter name. So if I can, come in here, let me just put content type, we'll see what happens. Type. Perfect. So I'm going to save this. Let's go back. Let's send. There we go. So now that error is gone, right? And it's telling me I'm also getting another header that I'm not aware of. It's called expect, right? So once again, you can see here how granularly you can determine what the partner is allowed to send you or not. So in this list, and I'm doing this so that you could see the value of the ignore statement, right? Kind of like building this sort of config here to tell, it takes a few seconds here. So this should go away. There we go. So now there's something else, but it's okay. That's because the API is not technically supposed to work. So this is grand. So you kind of saw here how I'm determining what parameters you can send in for the headers. And if something is unspecified, I'm preventing you. If the specified parameter action is on detect, you get kind of like the error I showed you. And if I put prevent, you're going to actually see the error message, right? So we're saving this, going back. And right here, this is kind of the friendly detect error message. And give that a second here. That's probably going to the back end and throwing something else. So we're not going to see anything. There's nothing wrong here, right? If I go to my inbound processing and then here, I say, if somebody has expect in there, I want you to, prevent. Like you're sending that in, but I don't want you to send that header in. Let's see what happens. There it is, unspecified header. I'm not allowing you to do this. So you saw it takes a couple of seconds sometimes for you to evaluate, for the tool to evaluate this element here. So you kind of are seeing it here. So you can granularly do a few things, right? We saw, for your content, definitely, what is the size? You can go take a look at, the, I'm going to say like the payload, if it was JSON versus XML, we saw that you could do that. You could see if the content types were appropriate that were being sent in. You can do a transformation and map them. We're seeing that we can manipulate, the headers. You could do it with the path. You could do it with the query. It's all the exact same technique over here. So we're kind of seeing that here with the validate parameters. And remember I said at the start that there are two different ways of validating the headers, right? So you have, I can evaluate the header on the way in to my API and then validate the headers on the way out of the API. So this bottom part here on the outbound scope is validating the headers on the way out, right? So it's possible to say, if the header is unspecified, I want you to prevent it and put everything in this variable name here. Works similarly to this fashion here. If the specified header is found, what do you want me to do? You're going to ignore it. If it's unspecified, prevent it. But you can then go ahead and put in the parameters that you are enforcing. The last item is the validate status code unspecified. Unspecified status code, what do you want to do? So if your spec says that you can do 200 and 400, that's perfectly fine. But if something is unspecified, what do you want to do? I want to stop it. And what would that look like? So if you go inside of your API spec, you'll see it has like the response is 200, 400. If I were to send a 500, we definitely don't want too much information leakage. We could block this and then send like a generic kind of like a, different type of error message if we want. If it was a 201 or something else, what somebody's trying to manipulate the API to see if we can do different things that may not be in the spec or is in the back. Definitely don't want to share that. So that's one of the functionalities that can do. So on that, I think we kind of covered the full flow. We've done, validating of the content, validating of the parameters. We decided to use headers as an example, but you can definitely put your query string here in your path, but things are exactly similar to this where you put the parameter. And then lastly, on the outbound, we have validate headers, functions the same way, and then validate the status code where you can take the statuses inside your API and manipulate them. So at probably 40 minutes now, I think that we're, I would say at time. I wanted to keep this somewhat of a shorter session for all of you. So thank you for having me this year at the Azure Back to School. If there's anything you wish to try out, and don't be shy. You can reach me on Twitter at Joel Hebert, and I'll gladly do a one-on-one or just have a fireside chat with you. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next year. Cheers.